On this episode of the No City on the Sideline Dad, my guest, Dr. Michael Fenster. Dr. Mike is a cardiologist, professor, chef, author, storyteller. Dr. Mike is a evidence-based insight, unique perspective of food, health, and its relationships. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Mike.
Hey, Joe, thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
You know what's funny? I know it's kind of one of those easy questions to ask at the beginning of a podcast, but you have a unique situation. Being a cardiologist and a doctor and a chef. How did that all come about?
You know, food actually came first. When I was growing up, I was very fortunate. I had a great mom and dad, and my mom was really good, home cook. And we moved around a lot, and I'll show my age. It was way before the internet. And so I was kind of always a new kid in town, and that can kind of be rough on kids. We didn't have the internet or streaming games and things like that. But I always found sanctuary in the kitchen, cooking with my mom, because she'd always be cooking Julia Child or Galloping Gourmet. And so it became a sanctuary place for me growing up. And I have a lot of great memories of time spent there with my mom. It really taught me kind of the fundamentals of cooking. And when I went off to college, I had to work to help pay for college. And so it was very natural for me to get a job in the food industry. And, back then there was no Food Network. Julia Child was the celebrity chef, and it was a job nobody wanted, right? Because you're in college and you're working, it's Friday, Saturday nights, your friends are out. But I started there as a dishwasher, worked my way up over the course. So by the time I left college, I was, running the back of the house. I went off to medical school, but I always kept that love of food. And eventually, through some of my own challenges and looking at my diet, I really came back to the roots of food and really worked on developing this culinary medicine pathway that we're on now, and we're sharing with patients and other healthcare professionals and other chefs around the world.
It was interesting too. I think we had to talk about this before, and I mentioned something about being like a culinary, medicine compared to a dietitian. How similar and how different are they?
Well, culinary medicine is a little bit different. So the dietitian is going to focus on the diet, the way we teach it now, and really draw on a lot of information for what we call legacy nutrition. So that's certainly very much a part of culinary medicine. And dietitians and nutritionists and are really, who have taken our course or sort of our frontline folks. They're really the ones who engage with patients and help prescribe a culinary medicine program that's individualized for them. But in the scope of culinary medicine, we're really looking at lots of things, and that's what's different about culinary medicine is it's a shift in this perspective on how we view food, not just in terms of nutrients, but in terms of an experience. And so we have to look, and what we're finding out, I've been talking about it for over a decade, but the evidence is really coming to the forefront now that pizza's not a pizza. How we make our food is very important, and it's not just the nutrients that are in it. It's some of the things that are left out and some of the things that are added. And so we're looking at how our food is produced, and produced in a sustainable way for ourselves, because we love the flavors and we love eating delicious things, but also in a sustainable way, for the earth, for our planet as a whole. So we look at things like, industrial monocrop agriculture, regenerative agriculture. That's part of the story of culinary medicine. We look at not just what we're eating in terms of the nutrients, but how we eat. So we're looking at things and data sets from things called MB Eats, MB-EATS, mindfulness-based eating awareness techniques, and how our attitude when we sit down and eat and what we focus on can affect our health. We're looking at the gut microbiome, all those bacteria that make up what we are, which is essentially ecosystem. So all those things are in culinary medicine.
Well, you just said two things I found interesting. Pizza's not a pizza. That
Yes.
was one thing. So I mean, going to like the local pizza place, a name brand place, and buying that pizza or making it at home. I mean, is there a difference? Because is it
Huge difference. So you got me really excited because before I had to take a series of shifts where I was on call every Friday on Clubhouse at noon Eastern. I would do creating a healthy pizza with the pizza doctor, and that was me because I love pizza so much. And so let me tell you a little bit about my pizza. So I'm getting some organic wheat.
Hmm.
And this week I'm making sourdough pizzas, but either sourdough is a rising agent, little yeast, salt, and water. That's it. No
Oh,
sugar added, not all the things. And it goes into what we call long ferment, which increases digestibility and increases our ability to extract nutrients and things like that, easier on our digestion. Um, Ferment also brings flavor, as we say in the cooking industry. And tomatoes, the tomato sauce, it's tomatoes.
hmm.
Like that's it. No sugar to make it sweeter. None of this. A touch of salt. That's it. The cheese, fresh Italian buffalo mozzarella from grass-fed cows. Doesn't get any better than that. And then a little fresh basil. And when we look at that and we look at what that food is and we analyze it in something called the NOVA classification, which is a way to look at foods in terms of their processing, we find this is what we call a group 3 food. Really very good for you. Now, let's look at the other thing, which is an industrially produced pizza from any one of the name brands they're dropping off at your house. All the stuff that they put in there, all these preservatives and sugars and additives that are in there and in the toppings. It is one of the 10 worst foods we could possibly eat for ourselves on the planet. Doesn't taste real good compared to that, real pizza Napolitano that I'm making. And it really shows that when we eat that type of food, which we would call a group 4 or ultra processed food, man, that is associated with a tremendous health risk. So we're at a point where we've changed our food and food pathways that, like as you said, a pizza is no longer a pizza, and so we got to stop thinking in those terms.
It's interesting too, because I know a slice of pizza right now at the name brand place, it's close to like almost 1,000 calories. Or maybe too slight. I mean, I know and usually the grease and the best, and making it home. I admit, I mean, I buy the processed cheese and stuff like that, but making it home, it tastes different when you pull that dough out and you flour the flour on there, and it just tastes better. It tastes better
It's
and stuff like that.
yum. It's real food. And what's amazing too is, I talk to people and you eat it and you don't get this bloating. You don't feel gross and greasy after it. You feel good and you're usually filled up with less. And that's part of it too. One of the great things about cooking at home from my memories is you can involve your family, you can involve your kids, teach them the skill, because when the pandemic hit, so many people were caught flat-footed. It's like, if I can't buy bread in the store, I'm out of luck. Yet, flour, yeast, water, salt, you can make all kinds of breads.
Yeah, it's the lost hour with the convenience of everything in the store now.
Yeah.
And not knowing how to do stuff like that, it's a lot. It's probably a good idea to be learning that stuff too, just in case of situations from the pandemic and stuff like that. And well, another thing too I found interesting, another word, it was mindset based. Mindset based. I think that what you said.
Mindfulness-based eating awareness techniques is
Yeah.
is kind of what they refer to it in the literature, MB Eats.
Hmm. What is that?
So, mindfulness, and a lot of people think it's just kind of sort of woo-woo stuff. I've done martial arts for decades and decades, so I was exposed to this when I was in Japan studying many, many decades ago, and we learned it because it helped us focus. So our goal was to engage in mindfulness training so we didn't get hit in the head. Very practical application of mindfulness. But it was about developing that ability, to focus and focus on certain things, and we can do that around our food. And when we use our food or we approach our eating with those techniques and engaging in mindfulness exercises, we can measuring things like markers of inflammation, looking at things like how we age, how fast we age. We obviously have a chronological age, we're so many years old. But you ever notice that, there's somebody that maybe you went to school with and they look like 10 years older than they should, and then somebody else looks like 10 years younger?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And that's something we call physiologic aging, because that we actually do age at the level of our cells very differently. And there are techniques to measure that. One of them is looking at our cells, and we measure little things called telomeres.
Hmm.
And telomeres are essentially When you tie your shoelaces, your sneakers or whatever, tennis shoes, those little plastic caps at the end that keep.
Yeah.
Okay. Those are what like telomeres do. And they do that for our DNA because our DNA is always untying and then retying as cells divide. So those are like the little caps that protect our DNA from shredding. And as we age, they get smaller and smaller. So it gives us an idea of how old we are really in our bodies as opposed to just our age. And what they've shown is that when people engage in these types of mindful activities like mindfulness eating awareness techniques, mindfulness-based eating awareness techniques, we actually can slow down our physiologic aging. And that's associated with better health. Interestingly, when we look at people who, and this was just published within a year ago, people who eat those ultra fast, ultra processed, fast food diets, what we find is that's associated with increasing our rate of physiologic aging. So what we eat and how we eat affects how we age and our health at the moment as well.
Well, it's interesting too. And certain people like, you go to certain stores in certain areas and in certain communities, especially with the low income communities, you see the stores ultra high processed food, stuff you never see in a store that a little bit more has a little money or a different part of the city or something like that. And it's just interesting to notice the difference in where the food is located and how processed it is.
Yeah, and that brings up sort of the issue of food deserts, meaning that we can't find healthful food in places like that. But it was very interesting. They just published some data a couple months ago looking at things like this, and a fascinating thing came out, particularly looking at young people. So they looked at kind of from age 5 up to age 19, our kids, who are going to grow up, and what they found is that it really didn't matter what socioeconomic level you were. All our kids ate crap. From about age five, almost 70% of their diet is ultra processed crap. And you think diabetes and inflammatory bowel disease and heart disease are bad now? Just wait, a couple decades on this type of diet. It's going to be beyond epidemic proportions. What was interesting, though, is that they found, and there is other research to back this up, is that when they looked at African Americans and Caucasians, they were very high up there. But when they looked at those of Hispanic descent, what they found is that those kids had a lower, statistically significant lower consumption of ultra processed foods. And when they dug into that data a little deeper, it turns out that it comes back to family and family meals. And the idea that at least a couple times a week, maybe just on the weekend, they're sitting down, they're getting better food, and it's that family meal interaction. There's a study, and I believe it was out of Harvard, where they looked at that and they found that kids who have family time, family meal, maybe not every meal, but several times a week, as adults, they're healthier, their diets are better, they eat less ultra processed food. So it's a sustained benefit that we can give our kids by simply eating with them and eat real food with them.
Well, it also has a social benefit too, I guess.
Yes.
Definitely that
absolutely.
too.
Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of curious. I got an idea, but I want to hear what you say. Is what is ultra processed food?
Okay, great question. So we generally use in our culinary medicine approach what we call this NOVA classification, which was developed at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil a little over a decade ago, and is really a lot of data supporting this. So group one it's just raw food. So it's an apple. It's it's ground hamburger meat. It's that sort of thing. A group 2 food is when we take those foods and we make other ingredients with them. So it's like butter, or olive oil would be a group 2 food. A group 3 food is when we take those ingredients and we make something like that wonderful, delicious pizza Napolitano I was talking about. A group 4 food is what we call ultra processed, and that's very different because it contains things that are either rare or never used in a culinary preparation. So as a professional chef, they're making food with things that I would never use in my kitchen, and or contains additives and preservatives that are primarily designed, and flavorings primarily designed to hide the artificial ingredients that they're using to make it. And one of the characteristics of this is that they're hyper palatable, meaning they are actually constructed foods. Great book called The End of Overeating in America by David Kessler, who is a former head of the FDA.
Mm-hmm.
And he always had a weight issue. And so when he finished at the FDA, he went around and visited these food manufacturers. And it's an intriguing insight into how these foods are actually crafted to addict you so that you crave them. And they do that by adding these things so that they can maximize levels of sugar, salt, and fat, because those light up the pleasure centers of our brain, essentially like cocaine, like opioids. And we become addicted to it.
It's almost like soda. Soda is
Yeah,
addiction.
soda is a great example of an ultra processed group 4 food. Absolutely.
You're trying to get off soda, and then when you, I mean, I had a problem with soda, but I don't have much anymore. I don't drink as much as I used to. But I know I went on, I got soda, like, cut it right out, and all of a sudden I got massive headaches and felt kind of like dizzy and stuff like that. Like, it's almost like withdrawing from like medication.
Well, it is. It's an addiction of sorts. And, to give you an idea of drinking 1 can of soda per day increases your risk of a heart attack by 30%.
Oh, wow.
Americans, on average, drink 50 gallons of soda a year. And in the last 3 decades, the consumption of high fructose corn syrup, which is the cheap sweetener developed in the 70s that's used in all these, sodas and a lot of these energy drinks, etc., has increased in the United States by over 10,000%. And one of the things about high fructose corn syrup, which you find in a lot of these ultra processed foods, is that we don't metabolize, we don't handle that fructose the way we do when it comes in an apple or a pear. It does 2 very important things. It gives us a load of sugar right away, and that type of sugar is immediately taken up by our liver and stored as fat. So that's bad. And then the second thing that it does is it goes to our brain and it shuts down what we call the satiation response, meaning as we eat this, we're getting calories, our stomachs are distended, and all these signals should be going, hey, Mike, you've had enough to eat. You're getting full. Let's slow it down. It turns those off. So you're eating, as you said, those, thousands of calories in that food, and yet the food is telling you you're still hungry.
That's why I get drinking soda and eat Chinese food. Is that must be the reason why Coke, I have a Coke and Chinese food, and I just keep on eating Chinese food and it never ends. That's what I feel sometimes.
Yeah, well, it is the sodas. They definitely are a real Achilles heel. But big soda is such a powerful industrial force. I mean, if you sit there and you just sort of pay attention as you watch TV, if you're not streaming something without commercials, and how many of these commercials are energy drinks, fast food, and sodas.
It's big business, big money.
Very big business, and globally big business. And that's where the difficulties come, because a lot of these ultra processed giants operate, globally. And in fact, what you see, and this actually happened in Brazil, which was one of the driving forces for them to try to identify what was happening. Decades ago, Brazil became a emerging economy in South America, which means they had some money. Well, that means that these conglomerates come in and say, oh, well, if you have money, we're going to sell you stuff. A lot of that comes from the United States, and we export big food, big snack, big soda. And they noticed that all of a sudden, Brazilians were getting fat. They had diabetes like they never had it before, heart attacks in younger people. And so they started to look into, what was causing that. And there's a clear correlation with consumption of this ultra processed food. And unfortunately, not one country that has seen this increase in overweight, obesity, diabetes, etc., not one of 195 countries on the face of the planet have been able to reverse that curve. And the data came out for the United States last month, actually, I guess about 2 months ago, and there was a 40% increase in overweight and obesity across the board in the United States. Even though now Americans eat less red meat, less butter, less lard, less eggs, less pork than they ever have. They eat more chicken, turkey, fish, all the recommendations. They've switched and consumed tons more vegetable oils, and yet we're still not off this horrible, roller coaster that we're getting to a tipping point on.
Well, I have an interesting question about eggs. Are eggs bad for you? I mean, there's brown eggs and white eggs. What's the difference too?
Not really a whole lot of difference in terms of the color of the shell. That more reflects the breed that they come from.
Hmm.
Um, eggs eggs are the perfect story of how we've gotten it wrong in food and health. So eggs were never really shown to cause any problems, but the recommendations against them just came from extrapolation. So there was a belief at the time that, oh, if you eat cholesterol, that gets into your blood, and that high cholesterol level is what causes blockages and you die of a heart attack. Eggs essentially are like loaded with cholesterol on those yolks. And so that extrapolation was carried over to eggs, said don't eat any eggs. The first part of the hypothesis is wrong, because what you eat in terms of dietary cholesterol has little to like zero effect on what we call blood lipids, what your cholesterol levels are. The second is that when we actually start looking at the studies of people who eat eggs, we find that actually people who abstain from eggs and people who eat eggs, the people who eat eggs actually have better cholesterol profiles than the people who don't eat eggs. Eggs are a great food. When we get eggs that are fresh, raised from chickens that are allowed to graze, pasture, eat naturally occurring products on the ground. And just so people know, chickens actually are not vegetarians. I don't recommend you buy vegetarian fed. You want them pastured because they eat bugs, and those are forms of protein that go into their eggs as well. And what we find is that better cholesterol profiles, improved health is associated with, in some studies, more than an egg a day. So we've completely gone 180 degrees on the old, eating eggs every day will kill you sort of thing. In fact, it's the opposite, eating, fresh, wholesome eggs. And again, when chickens are raised that way, those eggs contain things that we call omega-3s. You may have heard of, as a cardiologist, people say, well, my cardiologist told me to eat salmon. Why did he tell you to eat salmon? Because it's loaded with those, what we call omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are really, really healthful for us. They reduce inflammation. When you eat eggs from chickens, they're loaded with those kinds of fats. So eggs are great. I love eggs.
I had that for breakfast every morning. I had a kind of curious question about that and stuff like that. But you mentioned inflammation too. I mean, ultra processed food, do that cause inflammation?
Absolutely. And we're not exactly sure the mechanisms. My suspicion is that there's a number of them. One is that when we eat these ultra processed foods, as opposed to foods that we have evolved over millions and millions of years to consume, they affect these bacteria in our gut. And where we used to think these bacteria, like they live there because they got, bits of food that we didn't, couldn't digest, and it was like a great place for them to hang out and get a free meal. It turns out that they're essentially an organ. I mean, if I were to draw your blood right now, 40% of the communication molecules in that sample of blood would come from your gut or the bacteria in your gut. So they're in constant communication with us. Remember, our gut is also the home of one of the largest reservoirs of our immune system. What's called the GALT, or the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. So about 70% of our immune system lives in our gut.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so the bacteria in the gut are constantly communicating with our immune system, and then sending those signals to our brain and then throughout our body. And so when we eat ultra processed food, you know what? Those bacteria haven't evolved to deal with that, and it ends up sort of poisoning our garden, if you will. So if you think of these little bacteria like little sea monkeys I used to order off the back of comic books, or a little garden inside you where you want to grow these good bacteria, eating ultra processed food is poisoning that. And then what you get are harmful bacteria, and you start to get what we call leaky gut syndrome, and this ongoing chronic low level inflammation, which is a bad thing because that inflammation actually sets the stage for us to develop obesity, because that's involved with inflammation, then diabetes, then heart disease, and all these things seem to spring from that. So that is one way, in addition to some of the other just sort of really bad things for us that can be found in ultra processed foods, that they affect us and clearly correlate with what we call the disabilities and diseases of modern society: obesity, diabetes, heart disease, inflammation, Alzheimer's, neurodegenerative diseases, those sorts of things.
You said that obesity has a tied in with inflammation. How's that? What does that mean?
Yes. So what happens is, many people think, well, and the way we measure obesity, unfortunately, has to do with just the weight. But obesity is much more than just your weight. And in fact, there are people out there at a certain weight who are actually very healthy, just as there are people who look like they're in great shape who are very unhealthy. And what is associated with obesity, one of the bad things, is it becomes a pro-inflammatory situation, and it has to do with some of those fat cells can actually they don't just store fat, they can actually release mediators of inflammation, and that gets turned on and revved up. So people get into this pro-inflammatory state. It leads to the development of increased weight, because it's not just about the weight, it's also where that is. And you've probably seen the commercials for the dreaded belly fat, right? And that is associated with inflammation, and is a marker of future risk for diabetes, heart disease, etc. So obesity, what's really bad about it is this inflammation, this sort of simmering brew that our bodies are in when we're obese, and we have these elevated markers of inflammation.
Well, so if a person's overweight and if they show in certain parts of body means different things.
If they're overweight and they're
Say Mike, your weight, where the weight's carried, does it mean
yes,
different things?
yes, it does. So, for example, as I mentioned, that belly fat that we see and is so sort of ubiquitous in the United States, that is very different than carrying fat in different areas of our body. In fact, we actually have two types of fat, believe it or not. So we
Oh,
have what's called a white fat. And when you get that white fat that's associated with obesity and inflammation and kind of sits in that belly area, that's very different than what we term brown fat. And the best way to think about brown fat is it's what allows like bears to hibernate. So it's involved in thermogenesis, or sort of heating us up. So it's why whales and seals have this big layer of blubber, that actually keeps them warm. That those things are like brown fat that insulate and actually use calories, because they're involved in thermogenesis. And there's a lot of investigation in medical community and scientific community right now, looking at ways that we can access that and turn that on. And another really great example is brown fat generally is baby fat, right?
oh,
And they we don't worry about baby fat on babies. At least we didn't used to. And a lot of that is sort of that brown fat because it helps keep them warm, insulated, and they end up burning that off.
it's interesting too. I was just curious about that, because
Yep.
they always say that certain around your hips, around your backside, or and stuff like that. It was always interesting when you mentioned that. I'm like, oh, that good question to ask, actually.
Yeah. No, great question. You're absolutely right. It makes a big difference.
Well, also too is ultra processed food. Some people are always in a rush, always trying in a rush. The right now we live in a fast paced world, always connected to everybody, so we make poor decisions, and sometimes we don't always have the time to make a home cooked meal and stuff like that, and slow down.
Yeah, and I think we need to realize how important that is, because we think, oh, a pizza's a pizza, a burger's a burger, a steak's a steak, and we're coming to the realization that the changes that have been made on our food and our food pathways, primarily since World War II and accelerating, have really changed that dynamic for us. So, how do we do those things? How do we engage? And I said, family time, a family meal, cooking a family meal together, those sorts of things. All of a sudden, then it's not, I'm in the kitchen by myself. I'm showing my daughter, how to make something. I'm giving her a life skill. We're enjoying some time. We're talking, together, and what we're learning, that to go back to sort of that mindfulness, slowing down, taking that time is critically important for our health. And when we engage in that activity on a regular basis, and the research suggests, as little as about 12 minutes a day. And, it's kind of like going to the gym and anything else. The more you put in, the more you get out. But at a minimum, 12 minutes or so a day, and you could do it in, 5 minutes here and 10 minutes there, has been associated with maintaining, brain health as we get older. So a resistance to dementia. It's been shown to, again, reduce those markers of inflammation. And it just changes our brain neurochemistry in a very positive and a very healing way. A study came out of Harvard that was fascinating, and it shows that when we look at what makes us happy, what makes us happy is in the here and now. Unfortunately, about 42 to 48% of the time, so almost half the time, inside our brain, we're either in the future worrying about something, or we're rehashing something in the past that we can't change. So we're never in the present, even though that's where we get our happiness.
That's always so true. You're always well. There you're worrying about what you're going to eat for dinner that night or breakfast the next morning.
Well, yeah. So here's a great example, right? You go to a restaurant, this farm to table restaurant. You've been dying to go through. You finally get your reservation. You sit down. You're looking at the menu. You're so excited, and this entree comes out, and you taste it. And instead of doing a mindfulness-based eating awareness technique and saying, what am I tasting? How good is this? Oh, I'm imagining, the field that this came from. I'm into my food in the moment. We're like, God, should I have gotten that other appetizer? What do you think that other appetizer was better? And what about that other restaurant? Maybe I should have got to that other restaurant. I bet that other restaurant would have been. And then we eat our meal and we realize we weren't even present for this thing that we looked forward to.
One thing I'm interested too is myths about food and stuff like that. And one thing I was interested, I was doing a little bit of research before the interview and stuff tonight, is you mentioned something about red meat. Mm-hmm. Is there a myth about red meat? Is too much, too little? Should I cut out of my diet? A period?
As I'd like to say, and this isn't, it's my phrase. It was by Ms. Neiman, who raises cattle out in the West. He says, it's not the cow, it's the how. So it's red meat is probably one of the main factors, along with fish and seafood, why we became the dominant species on the planet, and particularly cooking our red meat and fish. And that's a great book by Richard Wrangham, who's a Harvard professor. But when we look at the data in fresh meat, and particularly we look at the composition of things like grass-finished cattle, so different from that industrial burger. And if I can draw an analogy, as a chef, if I'm going to make, some chicken nuggets, it's a piece of chicken and like 3 or 4 ingredients. To make a McNugget, and this is not a word of lie, it's like 36 ingredients in there. And it's formed into a paste and then punched out in a stamp, different stamps to make you think that it's fresh and there's different looking pieces. Clearly, those are not the same foods. And so when we group these foods together and we say chicken and we say red meat, this is that part of that perspective shift that we engage in culinary medicine. And to get, the folks that we work with, as well as the practitioners and providers, to stop thinking in the ways that they thought, which is hard because it's the way we've thought about food since there's been food. Chicken was a chicken, and like how rich you were was how many chickens you have. But now a chicken's not a chicken, a pizza's not a pizza, red meat is not red meat. And when we look at the data on that, grass finished, fresh red meat, we find it's not associated, with those diseases. Red meat, again, got its rap really from an association with saturated fat that was carried over with that same hypothesis when we talked about the egg. So saturated fat raises your cholesterol and therefore you're going to have a heart attack and die. And in fact, saturated fat does raise our cholesterol. Whoa, cardiologist, you said you could eat red meat, and you're saying it's raising my cholesterol. Interestingly, when we look at the types of saturated fat and we look at the type of cholesterol, so you've heard of LDL, or what we call bad cholesterol. Believe it or not, big surprise, it's not that simple. There's actually two types of cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. And when we say we're measuring your LDL cholesterol, and I give you a number, it's measuring how much cholesterol is in what we call that low density lipoprotein, or that fraction. And it's essentially like saying, hey, Joe, you have a pound of plastic, or you have 2 pounds of plastic. But in that pound of plastic, I can make like 10 really big beach balls. And that's what we call type A, or good LDL. And it's not really associated with disease. It's not associated with heart attacks, diabetes, etc. So it's good. And also when we eat red meat and saturated fat, our HDL, or good cholesterol, goes up. And one of the most potent markers of disease is that ratio of HDL to LDL, and it doesn't change. And in fact, some cases it actually gets better when we look at eating saturated fats from red meat. When we look at that ultra processed diet, they're taking that pound of plastic and they're making 100,000 ping pong balls. So that's what we call dense, or small, or type B LDL. And that's what's associated with diabetes, heart disease, etc. And so when we look at red meat and eating red meat, again, Americans have reduced their consumption of saturated fat over the last century, the latest data we have, by over 20%. What have we gotten for that? What's the bang for our buck, Joe? We've gotten even more obese at 42%, more diabetes, more of all these diseases. So, to keep going back and say, don't eat red meat, don't eat saturated fat. Well, America has done that. It's not rescued us. So we have to start looking at things differently. And that's where I say, it's not the cow, it's the how. And here's one of the things that will also blow your mind is that, all this sort of talk about, cow farts and methane and ruining the planet, cows, when they are raised on the farms in fed grass, allowed to graze, rotated properly, what we call regenerative agriculture, which is part of what we look at in culinary medicine, that ecosystem functions like nature. So what does that do? Those cows are actually fertilizing the field, and they're helping put carbon into the ground. So regenerative agriculture takes carbon out of our atmosphere, puts it back in the ground, what we call net sequestration of carbon. Now, if you want to eat your plant-based meat that is grown from soy, that's a monocrop agriculture, that's still putting carbon into the atmosphere. So you want to save the planet, eat a burger that comes from a cow raised the right way.
Well, I never heard of that way, because everybody makes a big deal about plant-based diet and stuff like that. That's the way to go. And I never heard of it that way. It's interesting.
Well, you think of it, and we talked about our gut microbiome. So often in medicine, and we view ourselves as this thing outside of nature, but food isn't fuel and people aren't cars. We're people, and we're social primates, and we exist as part of nature. And I think the bacteria in our gut, now that we've learned over the last decade how critical and how important that relationship is that we have with them, that we as human beings are actually an ecosystem, and then we function within this ecosystem of nature. It sort of makes sense that we have to learn how to grow our food and consume our food in a way that works with nature, not trying to dominate it with chemical fertilizers and pesticides and things like that, because that doesn't work. Basically, I call those exercises green deserts, because when you go there, what you find is that the soil is dead and the plants are alive because they're being fed chemicals and fertilizers and they're GMOs, so they're applying lots of herbicides and pesticides as well. But when you look, there's no living thing in those fields. There's no birds, there's no bugs. That's not how nature works. So, looking at things in this regenerative agriculture model, and it's also a model that makes delicious, tasty food that's good for us. And it functions as a natural ecosystem. That's what we really need to return to. And yes, it can be profitable. And the next question that somebody has is, yes, you can feed the world that way. We don't have to depend on the chemicals.
It's interesting too. I just was thinking about something too when you talk about that. And I just want to go back a second about the chicken nuggets you mentioned a few minutes ago. Because my son has had these they're veggie / chicken tenders. They grind up the chicken meat with the vegetables, and it's supposed to have like great percentage of vegetables and chicken at the same time. I don't know how they do it, but it's like that's what it says in the package, and all the marketing stuff too to people. It's just interesting.
Yeah, and make a here's a great a great counter to that. So I shared the little recipe. So I went down 7 miles from here. This guy has a little farm, and he does eggs, chicken, and raises some heritage pork. And these chickens had lived like a really long time, I guess, for chickens. They were like 3 to 5 years old, and they had laid eggs for many years and kind of reached the end of their life. So he slaughtered them, and they're old hens. And so I got those old hens, and I visited my other farmer at my farmer's market guy, and had a bunch of veggies. And I cooked the chicken in a pot with the veggies and made some dumplings, and it was so delicious. Versus this ultra processed paste, that comes out. I mean, in these sorts of things in fast food, they just did a study. They found that fast food samples were loaded with things called phthalates.
Yeah.
Phthalates are plastic.
Oh wow.
And it turns out that they're bad for our gut microbiome. So all this ultra processing stuff, and in terms of like the plant-based meats, we don't have that data yet, but one of the major brands uses GMO,
Mm-hmm.
proprietary GMO is in there. That is by just the way they make it, by definition, an ultra processed food. So two Harvard professors who for many years were very resistant to this idea, this week, actually, at the beginning of this week, wrote that, the data is so strong that if you can, you should probably start weaning yourself off ultra processed foods.
It's definitely interesting. Something to look into more about that and stuff. People shouldn't listen, and with the things going on nowadays. One thing that's interesting too is you have a YouTube channel. I
Yeah.
watched a little bit of videos and stuff like that, and
Okay.
it's very interesting too. You cooking all the food. I was getting very hungry.
Yeah, and all the food that's on there, that is food that I make, and then we eat it. So it's not like some of these fake things where they're pouring glue in, so the cereal looks appetizing and stuff. So all the food that you see there and on the website, those are my creations. And I'm just very gifted because I will disclose that my wife is a professional food photographer. So she can take what I make and make it look really yum. But we usually, as soon as she's done with the pictures, and a lot of times it's cold, then we sit down and eat it.
That's a good benefit. Makes it look pretty, and
Yeah,
then you
yeah.
can eat it after the fact and too, and stuff like that. You also have some kind of programs too about culinary medicine for people like for doctors, for chefs, and just people who want to learn more. What is that all about?
Yeah. So what I teach at the University of Montana, we've been teaching for several years now, is an introduction to culinary medicine course. It's a 3 credit, 400 graduate level course on culinary medicine. And it kind of gives you, it's like an appetizer. So it's a
Mhm.
little sample platter of all the things that we talked about, non-ingredient influences, convenience culture. How do you source vegetables and fish? Are these organics worth the money? And first, thing we talk about is, what the heck's culinary medicine? What is that about? So many of the things we talked about on the show, and just a year ago, July, we converted that into an online program for folks from the university. It's all the same material, where the students have papers and things like that, and a time frame that they follow. This is completely self-study, but you get all the information. You get access to all the same information. And when you complete it, the university awards what we call a level 1 certification in culinary medicine from the University of Montana. And it's valuable, for some of the chefs, particularly like with pandemic related issues, and it hit the industry really hard. Some of them gone back and becoming personal chefs. they can show their potential employers, hey, here's my micro credential, my badge. You can go to Credly, look me up, and it shows I can fix food for you that's in line with these principles of culinary medicine. Physicians, we're actually working with healthcare entities and institutions in rolling out culinary medicine programs for patients. And then a lot of folks are just interested because the information is so confusing. I love it, right? If you couldn't tell, this is my wheel, it's my gig, and I work so hard to stay up on it because it's very contradictory. It's hard to decipher some of these things. The information is scattered in places. Like I said, this article about ultra processed foods it was in Cell Metabolism,
Oh.
from Nature. So that's not like really, it's not Bon Appetit to pick up and look for things and read about it. So it's for anyone that really, kind of wants to get a handle on what the facts are. And we're all evidence-based and data-driven. And so people can go through the studies. Don't take Chef Dr. Mike's word for it. Here's the study. You can look at it and you can decide. And that's what I love, because at its root, culinary medicine is about empowering ultimately the individual, because it's about you, Joe. It's about what you like to eat, what makes you happy, and those sorts of things. One of our guiding forces is the data from what's called the blue zones, where they looked at healthy populations around the world where there's these inordinate numbers of people, over 100, that are healthy and vibrant. And the Harvard Happiness Study, which asks a simple question. So what is it in our lives that allows us to be healthy, enjoy wellness, enjoy a long life and a happy life? And ultimately, it comes down to the quality of our relationships with each other. And also, from a culinary medicine perspective, our relationship with the food we eat. I want you to, we want food that nurtures us, and we want it to make us happy. And to be happy, it should be yum.
Well, I was going to ask you for final thoughts, but that was pretty good final thoughts right there. You kind of summed it up for me right there, Mike. Thank you. I really do appreciate it. I don't have to ask the question now.
Yeah.
Well, when they where they connect, find more about you, if they want to reach out and ask questions about your programs and anything in your books or anything like that.
Yeah. So if they go to www.chefdrmike, that's chefdrmike.com, you can find all the info there, including the recipes. And you can also then follow me on social media, and I'm usually posting stuff there. You can DM me. Sometimes, I'm on call for these long weekends, and I'm just me. So I answer all my own mail, as it were, and all the things. So if I don't get back to you for, a couple of 3 days, usually means I'm pretty busy on call, but eventually I will get there and get back with you. So that's the place to go.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mike. I really do appreciate it. All links will be in the show notes for this episode. I really appreciate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. It's been a pleasure. Loved it. Thanks, man.
Thank you.